Well, can I start? Yep.
Come.
Well, hello everyone. I would like to thank Professor Ang Hanley and all the colleagues of the Burbank Department of History, Classics, and Archaeology for
Oh my
inviting
God,
me
la Argentina está aprendiendo a hablar en British.
to share a little of my new book project titled A Body One's Own, The Making of Sex Change in Argentina. I want to start with a famous story. In 92, a police officer imprisoned an indigenous Patagonia from Rio Negro, Patagonia, for using a false sexual identity. The police took her to the Institute of Legal Medicine, where Dr. Cesar Fusone took numerous pictures and classified her as an hombre-mujer, a man-woman, and an invertido. Fusone was surprised for her presence. She did not match with legal and scientific parameters of sex. However, she was an important female member of her town. Her neighbors usually choose her as a grandmother of baptism because of her talents knitting and sewing clothes. Fusone told to the press that he's celebrating between the neighbors of that remote place and affirmed that by causing no harm, either damage, being an honest, hardworking, extremely skilled in weaving, embroidering, and other female work, no one ever observed his unique mania to disguise his sex. A journalist brought that her acceptance was a symptom of the scars of female presence in the region. Maybe it's possible that the negotiation of binary self-gender affirmation was easier in small communities where gender division of labor was strictly divided. These photographs were foundational of the ideas about sex change. They catalyzed imaginaries about the sexual and racial boundaries of the modern Argentinian nation, the limits of citizenship defined by contrasts like male and female, white indigenous, civilization, barbary, medicine, pathology, elite poverty, and city rurality. The encounter of at least two points of view expressed the struggles in the definition of the notion of sex, in which the uses of certain objects, gestures, and activities had materialized a body register as male or female. In this presentation, I will share with all you some ideas of my study of the early making of sex change in Argentina in the first decade of the 20th century. I focus on the embodiment of a new gender before the popularization of biotechnological procedures, as for example, hormones that emerged in Argentina in the 30s or surgeries in the 60s, when embodiment was built mostly over clothing or gestures. During this time of mass immigration and national modernization, as an expression of the concern of the Argentine elite about the trespassing of sexual boundaries, the stories of sex change became quite popular. In a context of social and geographical mobility, where creating social and legal exercise, the proliferation of these stories enrich and enhance the experiences of materialization of new genders. In this sense, these stories can be reduced to a concern for a transgressed rule, but rated as a symptom on how these actors defined as normals could be stimulated to fulfill their wishes by the circulation of sex change narratives, but also how they actively participated in the consolidation of a key sense of modernization, such as sex. The concerns about people crossing gender frontiers emerged in a crucial moment for the definition of the modern category of sex, while Argentinian doctors understood sex as an external expression of a genital and an internal presence of a reproductive organ in binaries, men or women, global sexual discourses at the beginning of the century began to progressively highlight elements surrounding the multifactorial condition of sex. For example, a very widespread idea about that there was a dominant and a dominated sex in every person. I argue that the cultural binary and restrictive notion of sex acts as a scaffold to embody a new gender. This meaning perform a platform that allows some people to experience a sex change, challenging their primary assignation to define themselves as men or women. By moving from one gender to another or seeking a whole life in their new gender, they were both making unestables and reinforcing their gender roles. In this sense, we show how, in a movement of national concern to consolidate social boundaries, as well as a deep material transformation, created by social and geographical mobilization, some actors were able to achieve social recognition for the gender transformation. In contrast with a long tradition of historiography that have reduced invertidos to the history of homosexuality, I want to highlight how studying both male and female sex change make possible to address gender materialization beyond seeking stable identities. This is to say that crossing gender frontiers did not always imply having sexual encounters with people of the quotation opposite sex. I want to highlight that the overrepresentation of male homosexual experience over other possibilities, as for example, the men that were defined as women in their birth, have restricted historical imagination about non-conforming gender expressions before modern sexual identities, as for example, transgender or transsexual. By bringing together male and female experience against the gender assigned at birth, I want to challenge the cisgender limit of historiography by pointing out the epistemological dangers of a perspective attached to fixed identities. Beyond the strict periods and teleological approaches, my book and this chapter builds an argument by a simple methodological principle, trusting on the words which with every person gave meaning to their own life. So I address to the healing power of history beyond the ruthless rules of the archives, distrusting the power of those others who had classified these stories. A call to understand our subjects on their own terms as the necessary respect for sovereignty over their own body. The topic of this presentation is the core of the first chapter of my book project, which aims to analyze the making of sex change in Argentina during the 20th century. This book refers to sex change as a category of historical analysis and considers its multiple layers, the discourse and the material experience that made it possible. A Body One's Owns studies the making of trans bodies in Argentina during the 20th century, the technologies, the policy making, and everyday body making, from the codification of modern notion of sex in the end of the 19th century, until the pass of the gender identity law in 2012, which requires state agencies to recognize self-perceived gender and forces private and public health systems to provide free access to gender affirmation treatments in Argentina. Photonic photographs are incomprehensible without considering the doctor's role in Argentina state building and social hierarchies reproduction. Its publication in a popular magazine of Buenos Aires points out the multiple dimensions encrypted in the indigenous classification. As we see, the free photograph affirmed affirming the social boundaries between the rational urban body of the doctor and the untrusted body of the indigenous as an object of science. Indigenous photographs circulating in popular postals and magazines and participating in the definition of the experience of the otherness in Argentina. In the massive markets of postcards, for example, indigenous bodies were painted with watercolor as the cacique being sent, images that was painted in pink in order to produce a feminization of his body to exact the male white Argentinian domination over them. And there are several examples of this kind of visual treatment. Likewise, figures of sex change circulating in popular cultural media. These characters were usually presented as foreign elements of the nation. So, for example, the Albanese family's clan that had women called women men that were defined as exotics. Also, the press highlighted adventures of female dress as chiefs, as for example, a man in Catamarca that was imprisoned by the police while using skirts, petticoats, and a Louis XVI boots. Also, the anarchist press tell us stories about trade union leaders that escape police, changing their clothes, and acting as women, among other examples. In Buenos Aires artistic circuits, gender impersonation became a popular show that popularized the idea of sex change. In the first decade of this century, the Italian artist Leopoldo Fregoli became a very famous character in Buenos Aires theaters. In his shows, he used to change quickly of costumes, an old French tradition. He first visited Buenos Aires in 1895 to present his acts in the National Theatre. Regarding his increase in popularity, he decided to continue with his visit with his visits until 1936. Male and female impersonation and cross-dressing was a global popular art. Postcards produced by artists in the United States and Europe circulated globally as the famous female impersonator Robert Bertin's pictures that were distributed in Buenos Aires and who also visited the city to perform in casinos. Transformismo, as it was called in the city, grew as a popular show with important local interpreters as the famous Aldo, who promoted his pictures with female dresses, sometimes dressed as a geisha, or Fatima Mirtis, who was a compadrito, a classic female lower class urban character of tango songs. I don't have time to describe all this kind of characters, but these characters help to popularize this idea of sex change through impersonation. When doctors, journalists, and artists participate in the definition of sexual boundaries, some people try to negotiate the condition of their gender's embodiments. I would just name one of the several examples that I describe and I'm working in my book. In 1994, Catalina Spill attended Dr. Jose's Laure office in the French hospital. She was a French maid of 23 years old, raised by a single mother. After her birth, a doctor in Paris pointed to her mother that the child had some male genital elements and lack of uterus. Under his recommendation, her mother decided to migrate to Argentina to give her daughter a new life and to get her legal papers as a girl. Catalina received a female education. She got to Buenos Aires at 3 years old. At 6, she entered the girls' schools, and as a teenager, attended a year to a female teacher former college. However, she could not finish her studies. When she was 14 years old, her mother sent her to a farm outside the city to avoid punishment for her unexpected body changes. In contrast with other girls of her age, she noticed that she did not have her period and that her body was not changing as she expected. She started using items to replace her breasts and to shape her facial hair. When she got 18, she moved back to the city and began working as a homemaid for a rich family. Some months later, she got a job as a maid in the maternity of the French hospital. In 94, after some days with pain from urinating, she visited Dr. Laure. Catalina's deep voice captured the attention of this doctor. He was furious and considered her a liar for hiding her true sex with female clothes. After a genital exam, he defined Catalina as a man with a 3 centimeters flaccid penis that reaches 6 centimeters and a glance size of 8 years old boy. I'm pointing out that he has a prostate and had no female organs. Lauder added that Catalina's female aspect was confusing. He described her as a man with virile aspect softened by a long hair. Um, Doctors this time used invasive practices to materialize binary sex, for example, early mutilating surgeries applied over hermaphrodites' bodies, what we call today intersexual bodies. In this report, Laure defined her as a pathological liar. No? Catalina was ashamed. She described that she stayed muted, covered her face overwhelmed by the mystery that we have just discovered. Shame and sadness were the main components of these stories. As the emotionless expression of the indigenous girl that Dr. Fosone pictures, Doctor's narrative paid particular attention of the gestures of rejection to their statements. Lyra was surprised that she wasn't uncomfortable with this lie. Regarding the mistakes that had been made in declaring him a woman, he does not complain or protest. On the contrary, he seems resolved to persist. He assures us that he has never dropped of being a woman. He thinks that his abnormality has appeared during his stay in the maternity hospital, where he claims to have read something in books about it. After being classified as a man, she begged not to be transferred to a male hospital ward, which the doctor respected by adding, notwithstanding his true sex, is placed in a woman's ward. The shaming that she showed was an expression, I read in it, expression of Catalina's self-perception as a woman, that being catalogued as a man meant a destruction of the self-image that she had worked to build over her whole life. Catalina had sexual encounters with women. She declared of having erections and wet dreams since she was 16. For Dr. Laure, this situation expressed a convergence between her true sex and her sexual orientation. The awareness The witness called by the doctor stated Catalina boosted to be dating a good man, an action that could be part of the negotiation of her female carnality with others. For medicine, what we today call sexual orientation and gender expression were part of the same nature. That's the reason why invertidos and homosexual were defined as a violation of male natural contracts. It's difficult to say in which measure Catalina was able to separate these two elements that in the moment were combined to define herself, but we know for her story that for maintaining a relationship with a girl and delaying her visit to the doctor and her resistance of being classified as a man, that for her maybe sex and erotic desire were different things. The body of the citizen. I want to use now two stories of mujeres hombres to illustrate other paths of negotiation of sex change. In 1994, a young teacher attended to Dr. Carride's office of the French hospital. He was looking for a solution for what he considered the great suffering of his life. Even if he had female papers, he recognized himself as a frustrated man by the mistake of a midwife. Juan asked for medical help to recover a sex that he has been denied to him. When he was born, he had a genital condition considered outside the standards of a penis or a vagina. So the midwife indicated her parents to raise him as a woman to avoid his future pain. Doctors made possible the incarnation of a new sex for Juan when they considered that the will of the patient converged with a scientific legitimate correction. Under correct recommendation, Juan wrote a letter to explain why he needed to be fully recognized as a man by the scientific community and the state agents. Juan believed in the power of science to restore his true life. Some years before, he had visited a well-known doctor promoted by the press, but the specialist told him that his only chance was to be treated abroad, something that he couldn't afford because he was a teacher. He considered committing suicide, and he stated that he considered committing suicide. After explaining the sufferings of living in the correct body, Juan pointed out that the doctor's notion of sex and his own were very similar. He understood that sexual orientation was an emanation of his deep male nature. He brought, "It is true that women aren't irrelevant for me, and that I'm charmed by female beauty and grace, but it is not a torment, nor a passion that I'm not allowed to enjoy. For the notes the doctor, we know that beyond genitalia, Caride measures one's body by considering things such as, for example, that he uses female clothes without any elegance, or that he has a very deep and strict voice that remember us to his true sex. The idea of being trapped in the wrong body widened one's notion of citizenship. He did not restrict his idea to politics. He understood that being a male citizen included public and private practices accepted for men. Juan brought that he had expressed his discomfort with his failed sex by the ideas of modernism and liberalism that I have struggled for, my fight against the rational uses of women that I was substitute for. Nevertheless, even some people expressed their support to my ideas were more the ones who faked to be with me. And even if I felt a gossip wave my back, I have always followed the path encouraged by strength, and I'm not able to explain. So in this letter, what Juan is explaining is that the liberal critics that he was proclaiming against this patriarchal situation were relating to his real nature. There was a man trapped in a woman's body. After the situation, doctors perform a corrective surgery, and after, with the help of the doctors and with this letter, he obtained a sex change certificate by the state, who allowed him to get married with his girlfriend. There were multiple practices to achieve social and legal citizenship. The picture that you are saying was the photograph sticker to Raul Luis Suarez identity card. He's neatly combined, wearing his tie and jacket. His clothing is no more than what is expected for a man of his social position, a custom officer. His lips are smiling into the photograph, something totally unexpected for a public document in which subjects are demanded to stay motionless. However, he expressed a little choice. I think that this photograph in the document seals a pact with the state. Raúl, by having this document, is a full citizen of the Argentine Republic, and, as he will be recognized until his death in 1930. Raúl Luis Suarez was born in 1982 in La Coruña, Spain. His father were the baker Modesto Suarez and the dressmaker Isidora Vázquez. They migrated to Durazno, Uruguay at the 1886 with her daughters Raquel and Ada Francisca. Some years later, they moved to La Plata, Argentina. After Raúl's father died, he moved to Buenos Aires City to get a job where his mother became a house cleaner until his death in 1995. After this, they were taken to a Catholic orphan. Then they went out of this institution and they work as dressmakers, a popular job among women that did not guarantee a proper life. In 1998, after Ada got married, Raquel traveled to Montevideo and forged his birth certificate to be fully recognized as Raúl Luis Suarez. In 1912, Raúl married Amalia, and some months later, he moved with another lover called Matilde. He became quite known in his neighborhood in Buenos Aires for flirting with women, and he got a job in the custom office and participated in a rich male sociability. I don't have the picture here. Nevertheless, his life as man found a limit. In 1930, he fainted and was hospitalized. The doctor was surprised. He did not have a genitalia that they expected to see under his thread. He suffered an uncontrollable emotional distress after this situation and died. And Matilde was accused of murdering him by poison. That is how Raul's story flooded the newspapers. Personal photos play a crucial role in the making of his body. The journalists that narrated Raúl's life got together pictures that had different kinds of power in the production of his social and legal belonging to the male world. For example, the self-portrait on his office was the perfect dominant manly representation of the period. The gesture, the use of the cigarette, the elegant clothes reaffirming the manly carnality. Furthermore, another picture in a cabaret dinner was used to reaffirm this social acceptance between the men of powers of his participation as a man. The spectacular making of sex. To finish with, or to open to lead to the Q&A, I want us to get deeper in the Invertidos world and its decadence. This is a picture of Aida. She was born in Buenos Aires at the end of the 19th century. She grew in an upper-income family, and from an early age, she showed her dissident to her assigned sex. With 20 years old, she got an administrative position in the big house, the Governor Palace, where she met an older man that a time later became her partner. Dr. Francisco de Vega defined her as an imitator of an honest woman. In contrast with other autobiographies published by doctors, Aida did not underscore her sexual appetite. She preferred to present herself as an ordinary woman. As Juan, her embodiment highlighted values expected for a woman of her social class. For example, she decided not to have sex with her parents until she got married. All this in quotation. There is an expression that could be read as an impersonation, with rituals that were very popular among invertidos of simulation of unions that were not legitimate by the state. In her wedding or his wedding, she wore a white dress and the hair adorned with orange blossom, and his husband used a frock and white gloves. They lived together for a year, and after some fight, they broke up. Aida got married again some months later with a second husband, a man with 2 children with whom she lived for 6 months until she died from tuberculosis. Between the first and the second marriage, Aida defined herself as a widow, always what she tells to the doctor. She had a time of mourning without meeting any other man. She described herself as a female spirit created to the man's love. Even if she liked her rocky orientation with her sex, she took her femininity beyond sexually or erotic, in contrast to the whole practices that made her feel female. Autographies of invertidos were trending in medical and cheap literature, as so the stories that were translated from other countries. Together with autographies, letters, theater plays, and poems, doctors and journalists published portraits. A medium-term perspective shows the popularity of taking pictures of themselves among, for example, other transgressive identities, as for example, travestis that are in the 60s. Used to take pictures to send to international publications in the US or Europe. Or in her memories, the travesti Malva, who was a Chilean who crossed Los Andes in the 40s, remarks that in the 40s and the 50s, she used to meet with her friends to take pictures of themselves with a confident photographer under the promise that he would give them the negatives or that he would burn it. For Aida and her friends, portraits were a field to achieve power over personal narration. This kind of photos demanded the photographer committed to taking it, to wear the best dresses, a pretty hairstyle, makeup, and a good scenography to make the image to persist over time. Little gestures such as the hands and the hips, the stretched dress, and the strict view of the camera were part of the traditional composition of female figures in the period. These pictures could be circulated among friends, lovers, clients, or just being an object of an intimate choice. Technologies as corsets help to exalt female figures, even if doctors expressed their concerns about the harms of this intimate clothing. Corsets were very popular among Argentine women since the end of the 19th century until the 1920s. It allowed them to refine the hip and stand out breast, and at the beginning of the 20th century was understood as a challenge to domestic rule as a sign of female incursion to public sphere. However, while the use of corset tended to become unpopular among women in the decade of the 20s, invertidos continue using it to maximize these female gestures. As Aida newspaper chronicles and medical texts highlighted the urban presence of mantras of women in Rio de Janeiro, Montevideo, and Buenos Aires. The famous journalist Juan Jose Rayleigh wrote a long article about the shadowy Buenos Aires, where there were more than 3,000 chiefs dressed as women, who he described as narcotics, sick, youngs, with beautiful facial features. Party organizers, owners of big collection of dresses, and quite compact friend gang, they became well known in police chronicles. Journalists published other photographs of these girls in public spaces, walking for a principal street as Florida, and riding carriage. These pictures were part of the spectacular, like what I'm trying to think as a spectacular edification of sex in public. They used as expensive hats, dresses, and jewelries that were more fabulous than the normal use of women, can be read as the cost of accessing to the female universe as a high-class woman. Maybe attending to parties of the elite, as some of them did, has given them some freedom and permission to avoid this punishment. Even if between the 1920 and the 30s, female clothes show more flexibility and girls are starting using clothes more attached to the body as the image of the modern girl, invertidos overflooded their femininity, showing a spectacular gender embodiment that could guarantee realness. Nevertheless, the incursions of the city were not always accepted. The struggle for carnality was tough. Some of them stated that they preferred to move in a coach and a carriage to avoid incidents with walkers that could sometimes attack them with violence. From a film-term perspective, the materialization of these photographs will become impossible since the emergence of legal codes that allow police to imprison them for public scandals in the 30s. It is possible that the legal codes for public morality approved in the city of Buenos Aires in 1933, then in the province of Buenos Aires, were the canalization of a social perturbance, a way of exclusion that could not be solved just with microsocial violence, a growing formalization of the sexual boundaries of citizenship. In fact, the code of the city, the 28, included the habilitation of imprison those who display themselves in public on the public highway or in public places dressed or disguised in clothes of the opposite sex, which could be read along with the massification of other technologies of embodiment as one of the turning point in the decadence of the invertidos world and the emergence of other experiences of sex change. So That's my presentation. Thanks.